business during COVID-19, and we're doing it in conjunction with SADAG and the Psychological Society of South Africa. If everybody would mind just going onto mute so that there's no interference during the Zoomcast, to let you know that this Zoomcast is being recorded and will be available to get a copy afterwards. You all have got the chat box on your right, I imagine. And I see Sandra has already posted the guidelines that were put together by the speakers for you to use and share in any way you want to. And please, if you've got any questions, would you mind posting them in the chat box? And when we get there to the Q&A, we'll try and address as many of your questions as we can. So I'd like to hand over to Judy Nokwedi, who's moderator this morning, who's from Business for South Africa. And we're so grateful to Judy that she has been involved in helping us drive this initiative this morning. And we hope that this is the first of many. So with that, welcome to everyone. And I'd like to
Thank you very much. Good morning, all. I presume I'm loud and clear. So a good morning and a Business for South Africa virtual welcome today. Today is day 42 of the lockdown. And the context and the content for today is informed by the purpose of Business for South Africa. So a 3-second plug for who is Business for South Africa. Firstly, Business for South Africa fully supports the decisive action taken by our Honourable President Ramaphosa and the government to help mitigate the health, labour, market and economic impacts of the coronavirus. As organised business, following a special NEDLAC COVID meeting that was convened in March, business immediately convened that evening and formed a group, Business for South Africa, to prepare for the role we would have to play. In addition to the Black Business Council, of which I am the Secretary General, and BUSA, Business Unity South Africa, we also reached out to like-minded organizations who shared the belief in a fact-based evidence approach in dealing with the pandemic and deciding collaboratively and actively how we as business could form a very meaningful partnership with government in order to use business resources, business capacity, business expertise to support public sector health initiatives, absolutely aware of the interdependent and intercorrelations between all sectors of our economy. And so today, really, we focus the lens of mental health, the impact of COVID-19 on business. We are joined by 2 excellent world leaders in their fields. They are subject matter experts who will share the perspectives on this very important topic. As business leaders, I am a chief executive officer of a 7,000 employee large company. We are justifiably focused on the here and now of the COVID pandemic, but we believe, and I very strongly believe, there is a looming second order mental health crisis that is only beginning to emerge and will emerge even stronger as a result of quarantines, stay-at-home, self-isolation, massive sudden shifts to working from home, and more importantly, the large-scale retrenchments that are looming. I think today, SAA, depending on the disputes with the unions and labor, will receive the dreaded letter. We call it the dreaded letter as to who is going to be first to be exited. Bearing in mind that SAA has been dealing with the repatriation of many of our South Africans that have been wanting to come home. So in the midst of working at the front line, like our doctors, like our nurses, like our cashiers and security guard workers, people are beginning to be laid off. Factory workers, mining operations, supply chain disruptions, these have all been affected. It is quite interesting that in business we have tried to promote and drive disruption and innovation, but none of us anticipated a disruption of this nature that would bring the economy to a standstill. So the Harvard Business Review has been writing on this matter, and many senior executives who have been lucky enough to do their MBAs at Harvard or INSEAD or Yale or here at WITS and UCT and our own leading institutions, the Harvard Business Review reports that since the outbreak of the pandemic, 75% people say they feel more socially isolated than before. 67% people globally are reporting higher levels of stress, greater levels of anxiety, and 53% say they feel more emotionally drained and exhausted. And this is a global study that was undertaken by Qualtrics and SAP during the month of March and April. So as I move to handing over to our wonderful panelists, I'd like to say that as human beings, we can handle change, but we do not do very well with uncertainty. Given the enormous uncertainty everyone is facing economically, personally, socially, the mental health statistics are as predictable as we anticipate, and they are even more alarming. And today we will meet South African experts. We in business have identified mental health as a serious topic, and we have asked our experts who have so generously availed themselves to be with us today to share with us and guide us as journalists and as business leaders and managers, what some of the, giving us a vocabulary to what we are experiencing, giving us a sense of what we can anticipate, and giving us some very concrete tools which we can leave this webinar with. And we are asking that every leader and manager should take the lead to mitigate the immediate impacts of mental health. Our research learnings show that mental health should not be outsourced to human resources. In fact, when we surveyed people in the areas that I work, people were asked to rank who they were willing to talk to about mental health concerns. And it's no surprise to learn that selecting from a list of of managers, peers, subordinates, the HR department, and company executives, South Africans are saying that they would rather, that the last person they're going to talk to is HR executives and human capital executives. They would prefer to talk about their mental health with their peers and their managers. So on that note, allow me to introduce, you've received the webinar advert, so you know who our guests are. It's Professor Stevens, a clinical psychologist and the president of the Psychological Society of South Africa. He has a long history in both clinical psychology and working also in communities. Casey Chambers is the operations director of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. And Dr. Kalinda Linda, quite a little bit of a mouth twister there, Kalinda Linda, is a clinical psychologist and a board member of the South African Depression and Anxiety Associate Group. So without much further ado, may I now hand over to Professor Garth Stevens to share with us his perspectives on this very important topic. And I'll go on to mute now. You can communicate with me on the chat site.
Thanks, Judy. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also to, of course, to Business for South Africa for the invitation. Just, it's been very generous of all of you to invite us and to invite me in particular to this webinar on the mental health effects, I suppose, on the world of work in the time of COVID more specifically. I have to say that I, like you, am very pleased that for once we are foregrounding mental health issues, because of course these tend to recede into the background in moments like these when we are talking about widespread disease or pandemics of this nature, and I suppose understandably so. Much of the public discourse that one tends to see at the moment, of course, tends to focus on the acute health and the public health aspects of the pandemic, followed frequently by an assessment of the economic impacts thereof. And then much later on down the line, of course, the psychosocial, which of course includes the mental health aspects of the pandemic. And as they begin to be realized as much longer term consequences, of course, they start to be foregrounded a little bit more. And so really thank you for organizing this. I'm really pleased to be able to be part of it today with colleagues and with all of you who are participating in the webinar as well. So of course the current debate, and if one has been following, any of you have been following it, the current debate is really still dominated again by questions around the extent to which we've either overestimated the morbidity and the mortality of COVID-19, of course, versus the effects of the closure of the economy and how we should really start to kickstart a return and a recovery plan. But all of this, again, forgets that mental health is ever present and tends to be left out of the conversation. So, again, really pleased that this has been put together by Business for South Africa. Of course, these aspects of social life are all interrelated in some way or another. So health, alongside economics, alongside the psychosocial dimensions of pandemics, all of course need to be considered cheek by jowl in many respects. So in the brief time that I've been allocated, I think I've been allocated 10 or 15 minutes, I'd really like to amplify the case for why it is that mental health is such a critical aspect for the world of work today, for business to consider in particular. And to this end, I suppose I'm really going to focus on three key points. The first point that I want to speak to really refers to the most visible aspects of mental health today. And these are aspects of mental health that many of you have already been hearing about. Kalinda will speak about this a little later on. And these are really the aspects that have started to gain some recognition in the public domain and reflect on the immediate effects of pandemics and the measures associated with them. In this instance, we are talking about measures such as lockdown, social distancing, self-isolation, quarantine, for example, and so on. So I do want to talk a little bit about those, and of course my colleagues will speak a little bit more eloquently about this in greater detail a little later on. The second really refers to the fact that mental health is not experienced in the same way by all people. In fact, mental health is much more differentiated. It is disproportionately experienced and is often invisibilized in many, many ways. And I would like to talk a little bit about the invisibilized nature of much of the mental health dimensions of the pandemic that I think will increasingly need to be considered if social life, if industry, if workplaces and communities are continue to thrive in some way or another. Here we know, for example, that mental health is not experienced in the same way depending on one's social location in a given society. Most of us would agree that mental health is often refracted through forms of social difference and social inequality in some way, whether this is race, whether it's class, whether it's gender, disability, occupation, socioeconomic status, and so on. So I do want to talk about not only the visibilized aspects, but also the invisibilized aspects and the disproportionate, differentiated ways in which mental health presents itself and expresses itself. And then finally, I think I want to end perhaps with a kind of cautionary commentary on pandemics and their broader social and historical impact. And to make the point that if mental health is not attended to, it becomes the potential lightning rod that draws to it a range of forms and types of pre-existing modes of social discontent. In other words, where there are elements of social discontent in a society already, and mental health is not attended to, it can potentially act as the catalyst that leads to social upheaval, organizational instability, and workplace disruption. I have to say, of course, that pandemics change the nature of society. And I think that we are all living in such a moment of change, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. And mental health is one of these elements, like I said, that can catalyze the longer term effects of pandemics to either be experienced positively or negatively. What we should be clear about, of course, is that the longer the pandemic lasts, and of course, there's again a set of debates about how long this may or may not last, the conditions of social restriction that prevail, or if they are drawn out, I think we are unlikely to return to the so-called normality of the pre-COVID-19 period. And so this is a moment for us to consider a new social compact of sorts that will involve different sectors of society, including business and labor. So with that background in mind, I think I'm going to go on to the point about the more invisibilized forms of mental health. Judy's already started alluding to some of this, and I think others will speak about this a little later on. And we'll probably do this in a lot more detail. But there are a number of immediate examples that come to mind here, of course. So one of the first things that you'll notice about most people's experiences in this period is that actually there are clearly heightened fears and health fears in our society that are prevailing, and they're clearly not irrational. These are not mental health problems. They're not neurotic, so to speak. They are very real, but they do bring with them an unusual level of public anxiety. And these elements of public anxiety are about loved ones, about safety, about our movement through the world, and so on. Public anxiety is quite an important issue because it requires attention in the sense that it is fueled partly by an oversupply of information, sometimes information that's not particularly accurate, not particularly helpful. And of course, people consume information quite voraciously. And this contributes in some ways to a kind of public anxiety that has resonances amongst populations. So to give you an example, after the Spanish flu made its way around the world in 1918, kind of at the end of 1920, there was a real noticeable increase in mental health admissions to psychiatric institutions in many parts of the world. More recently, in about, I think it was 2016, in the aftermath of the Zika virus in Latin America, we saw an increase of several 100% in the rate of medical appointments that people were making, partly in an attempt to simply manage the anxiety about health, the kind of health anxiety that comes with pandemic. Now, you can imagine that the impact on the health system on things like medical insurances, on workplace absenteeism, etc., cannot really be underestimated in a moment like this. And I say this particularly in the context of a fragile economy that South Africa currently experiences as well. Now, the kind of public anxiety is not the only thing that you see. Of course, the accompanying levels of high rates of depression, for example. Judy's already spoken about the possibility of layoffs, and we are now estimating that you may have rates of unemployment in South Africa in this year that reach up to 50% in some instances. We've again just seen another business rescue plan at one of the airlines. And of course, in a failing economy, you have increased possibilities of depression being associated with things like suicidality. You also have a general sense of social malaise associated with the restrictions on mobility and social contact. And for those who've kind of been in lockdown over the last 40 odd days, you'll know exactly what I mean when I talk about the kinds of social malaise where there's a disruption to rhythms in one's life. And it doesn't matter how you're trying to reimpose a rhythm, it's actually extremely difficult to do that when one is restricted around mobility and social contact. The other issue, of course, is that for those of us who have technology and where it is possible for us to work remotely, people increasingly report a kind of boundarylessness in their lives. You know, mornings tend to kind of phase into afternoons and evenings. They run into each other and over each other. Weekdays and weekends are undifferentiated. And for many of us who work in this area, this is what we refer to as the darker side of the gigabyte economy. The economy that is virtual, that is remote, but that also potentially escalates levels of stress and undermines the idea of a relatively healthy 40-hour working week, because of course the working day can be extended almost infinitely in this kind of mode. So depending on the nature and the unfolding nature of the pandemic, I think, you know, we have to be mindful that you may also, in addition to all of these things that I've spoken about, see additional levels of stigma. If it continues, frontline personnel will experience levels of trauma and fatigue. And I think we're also likely to see decreased levels of frustration tolerance. I'll talk a little bit about that. But all of these really have significant potential to negatively affect the world of work if they aren't proactively managed. Now, these are really the more visible aspects. But of course, there are more invisible manifestations of mental health consequences that we need to be mindful of as well. So as I was talking a little bit about decreased levels of frustration tolerance, I think one of the manifestations and expressions of the mental health effects of pandemic and lockdown and self-isolation, quarantine, mobility restrictions, and so on, is that you're going to see levels of domestic violence that have really soared in this period. And women and children will bear the brunt of this. I think that it's also fair to estimate that women will probably also be disproportionately burdened with the care of children, with the care of the aged and the frail, as well as for issues like homeschooling and other domestic activities. So I think in those sectors where women are particularly present in the workplace, I think one is going to have to think quite proactively about this over the long term. In addition, despite the current restrictions on things like alcohol and tobacco, substance abuse is likely to increase with increased social restrictions for a number of reasons. For the fact that these are often considered to be elements close to socializing in South Africa, but also they kind of part and parcel of the process of emotional numbing. And at the same time, this is very much part and parcel of many, many communities today. You also, I think, are going to increasingly see acts of non-compliance with restrictions. And I think that social conflict is likely to become more evident in many poorer and under-resourced communities because people are likely to experience these restrictions as a kind of untenable curtailment of their livelihoods and their lives. For middle-class people, many of us have the luxury of either stockpiling resources, or if you're struggling, you simply get into your vehicle, you go to the nearest supermarket and you purchase whatever you need to. But for many blue-collar workers who live in impoverished communities or who find themselves in communities that are under-resourced, this is not a possibility. And so the idea of non-compliance with restriction and social conflict, I think, is likely to be another manifestation of some of the mental health consequences here. We're already seeing a number of cases of conflict between security personnel and citizens who are breaching lockdown in this regard. So I think, one should watch this space. Ironically also, those services considered most essential today are often the poorest paid jobs, from cashiers and packers in supermarkets, to taxi drivers, to miners, to sanitation workers, security personnel, and frontline emergency first responders. And I think you're going to see increased levels of resentment and resistance to these jobs, resulting again in greater levels of absenteeism, workplace conflict, labor disputes, especially as many of these employers become increasingly frustrated with the precarity of their jobs on the one end, but the social expectation that many of us will have for them to literally put their lives on the line each and every day. So, of course, in other parts of the world, you've already seen striking healthcare workers who are indicating that there's not sufficient personal protective equipment available to them. And I think that this is no doubt going to heighten new forms of, will be heightened by new forms of a kind of elite panic in our society, where some are the very same people who are essential workers and are quite precarious and are also likely to find themselves at the receiving end of contagion, are often thought to be the source of contagion. In other words, the people who are most at risk often become labeled as the most risky. And I think, again, this is likely to amplify forms of social discontent. I want to kind of, I've been talking for about 12 minutes now, so I suppose I need to kind of draw this to an end. But let me just make one final set of points that I want to come back to on the matter of pandemics and the way that they change the nature of society. Sometimes positively and sometimes negatively, often both. The bubonic plague in the 14th century propelled Europe out of the Dark Ages. In the early 1920s in South Africa, some would have argued that, in fact, what the Spanish flu did was accelerated some of the laws against racial mixing that were the kind of precursors of apartheid, and in fact fast-tracked the migrant labor and the Bantustan system. In the 1980s, we saw the eruption of HIV/AIDS that, of course, heightened stigma around sexuality in particular. But it also gave massive impetus to the LGBTIQ+ movement. It really challenged private healthcare systems and ensured that something like HIV/AIDS, for example, today is a prescribed medical minimum benefit, when in fact at the time, you'll remember, for those of you who were around in the 80s, you'll remember that there were all kinds of exclusions on the treatment of this. The point that I'm trying to make is that pandemics change the world in potentially profound ways, especially if they are protracted, and they also sit on an economic edifice that is already failing. And this is the case in South Africa in many respects. And one such site that challenges or that this change constellates around is in fact that of mental health. The cautionary comment for all of us here is that if we do not proactively engage mental health, the effects and consequences that mental health brings with it in this moment, that it's likely to illuminate levels of inequality much more, precisely because mental health disproportionately affects the marginal in our society and will affect the marginal even further in this particular moment. So I raise this because now is the time to perhaps consider new social contracts between business, labor, and government to minimize the negative effects of the pandemic in the long term. And I think it's really important for those in leadership in business to think quite carefully about their role at this particular moment in time. Because their role is not only to be fiscally astute, but to be socially attuned and psychologically savvy in the time of COVID-19. So Judy, I think I'm going to leave it there, and then we can pick up some questions afterwards, if that's okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor. I think colleagues on the call, the input provided by Professor Garth Stevens is around the context, because mental health does not only manifest at an individual level on the couch. That is almost the purvey of many middle class South Africans. And so it was very important for us to get a sense of that when the mental health condition of a community becomes an action, an agency of community, you can then no longer control it. We are now going to move into how mental health is experienced at an individual level. And both Casey and Dr. Lucinda Lindy are going to talk about both how the leaders experience it and how the worker experiences or the employee, and then we'll have some practical steps around we take it forward. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Casey Chambers, who is Operations Director at SADAG, to just give us a sense of what some of the data and what the numbers are revealing. Over to you, Casey.
Thank you very much, Judy. I appreciate it, and welcome to everyone. It's such an important opportunity to talk about this topic, which I think in all the other important things that are happening in our country on a daily basis, to have mental health on the forefront and to talk about it, and hopefully to be proactive in how we address it, can really make a difference. As SADAG, many of you have worked with us and we've done stories before, and often the way that we look and treat mental health is very reactionary, and we react to a crisis. And I'm hoping that through starting these conversations, that doesn't end in just one webinar, but that the more that we talk about it, the more that we can actually try to make a difference and provide support. So my role, I only have 5 minutes, and many of you know, which is incredibly difficult for me. But again, this will start conversations going forward. One of the things I just wanted to highlight, and I appreciate Prof. Stevens just going through as painting a picture as mental health in the country, because it is complex and it's complicated, and it's not just one aspect that it affects an individual, because it affects all aspects of their life, whether they run a business, they're a head CEO, or they're an employee on the ground. Mental health in the workplace has always been an issue with regards to discrimination, stigma, misinformation, and just the fear that admitting or disclosing that you have a mental health condition can actually put your job at risk, at further risk. And people often think that you're weak. And I think during a time of COVID, so many people are in the same storm, but in different boats, is that we're all overwhelmed, feeling anxious, stressed for various different reasons. And we go through that roller coaster of emotions. I think also for businesses, why mental health is so important is because there's a direct link to investing in mental health of your employees on your bottom line. We also know that if not treating mental health or addressing it in the workplace, it has profound impact on absenteeism, presenteeism, and the fear as well in this global pandemic that where we're sitting in a crisis is that if we don't look after mental health, it could actually increase depression diagnosis, increase hospitalization, and even some cases suicide, which we know is an ongoing issue on a daily basis with the high rates that South Africa has for suicide, especially amongst men, where they're 4 times more likely to commit suicide than women. So just to share some of the things that SADAG has been observing since lockdown, and just within our call center, there's been no disruption in our services. Our calls have doubled during lockdown and dealing with COVID. We still have a lot of mental health issues that people are calling and accessing help for, but a lot of people, because of COVID-19, are reaching out for help. And this is why it was such an important topic for us to partner with B4SA on putting guidelines, because we're getting calls from managers, from leaders, from employers saying, I have to make these really tough decisions. What do I do? Or they're also dealing with having the risk of losing their jobs or losing their companies and not having an income. And I think that responsibility of looking after employees and looking after them during this time is really profound and has really increased their anxiety and stress. We're also getting the real day-to-day on-the-ground issues from employees who have now been catapulted into unemployment, worried now about how they're going to get the next meal on the table for their family. You've had households that perhaps had 2 incomes that have now come to 1 income, which has also been reduced. And like Judy mentioned earlier, you every day you're dreading, when are you getting that letter? Is it going to happen? What is going to happen to my company in a month's time? Job security, that uncertainty, and living with that anxiety all day, every day, starts to overflow into every other aspect of your life, which is already pretty stressful, where now people are trying to work from home. And I think a lot of people are using that term so loosely, is that we're working from home, but we forget that we're working from home in a crisis. So it's very different. The normal ways of working has completely changed, and that's added extra stress. And I think with the real issues that people are dealing with, job loss, retrenchments, unemployment, we're having to, we're getting SMSs and emails from people saying, I had a job, I'm now unemployed and I can't pay my rent, I'm going to be kicked out. And these are really serious issues. It's not just let's talk about it. It's about coming up with really practical tips and tools for them. People who had a job a month ago are now standing in queues getting food parcels. It has a huge impact on people's mental health, and especially a breadwinner who's looking after families. An online survey that we did during COVID actually looked at some of the stats that we got and will be shared with everyone as well. 62% of respondents were employed, but 58% were unemployed. That's more than a third of the respondents. And we know, again, this specific cohort is a specific number of people. It's not nationally representative, but it gives us some insight into what households are dealing with. So I think those are some of the issues that we're seeing on a daily basis that are very real, that are creating new crises for people on a daily basis. We're seeing more anxiety, more people overwhelmed. I think also we forget that this anxiety and stress overflows into our physical and our mental well-being. It affects our families, it affects our children, it affects all aspects of our life. And people are really battling and struggling. And we see this from the number of people accessing our online chats. We're getting about 5,000 to 15,000 people going on a daily basis looking for information. We also must remember that if these issues are left untreated and no support is put in place, it has serious consequences. And we know that the leading cause for suicide is undiagnosed or untreated depression. As many businesses, the responsibility of looking after themselves, their own families, their own employees is incredibly high. And I think it also comes through, we're trying to cope. How do we help other people cope? And it's kind of that airport mentality of putting your own oxygen mask on first before you can help others. And this is probably the perfect time that we actually start looking at making mental health a priority in the workplace, especially in an environment where we can't control the guidelines, we can't control the restrictions, we can't control what's happening to the economy, but we can control how we look after our employees and our staff. So some of the things that even SADAG has been doing is we're running a lot of different webinars for different companies on talking about mental health in the workplace, equipping managers with what to say, what to do, and using this time of everyone working at home where we're not able to operate as business as usual, to really make sure that we're making this a priority and changing the conversation that employers are having with employees. We're encouraging, and through the guidelines that we're sharing later today that will be available on the Business for South Africa website, it's just an introduction to really looking at mental health in the workplace, specifically during COVID-19, to both empower and equip managers, line managers, employees, employers on what symptoms to look out for, what to do, and how to access help. For companies who have the luxury of having an employee assistance program, it's really encouraging managers to find out what benefits are available and telling your employees how to access them and encouraging them now to access them before there's a crisis. Really looking at building coping and resilience skills before there's a crisis. For a lot of small businesses on the ground who don't have employee assistance programs, but how do they access free resources so they too can look after their employees or even themselves? So one of those things is we're really just trying to be proactive, get this information and start these conversations within the workplace. Some of the things that we're also going to be doing this time, and I'm hoping that from the questions that you're asking throughout the session, and I'm going to wrap up because I know my time is short, is we want to have ongoing discussions on this, because this is a really complex issue with real problems that need real solutions. I think to use this opportunity to problem solve can really make a big difference to how companies address mental health in the workplace going forward. Mental health impact is going to be here for a very long time, especially as we deal with COVID-19 months, if not years from now. It has changed the way we live, how we work, how we respond to crises. And I think if we put in measures now, we can really make a difference. Thank you, everyone. And I'll be here to answer questions. Judy, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Cassie. We are now going to go to Dr. Kalinda Linda. And Dr. Kalinda Linda, if you could also talk more specifically between the relationships, the complexity of the relationship between the employer and the employee, and how that the challenges at a psychological level and the manifestation of that and the tensions, and how in particular we need to pay attention to the human rights and the human dignity matters or issues of the worker. And then, of course, as you go up to the C-suite, so the workers experience it on the factory floor, the shop floor, the workplace, but your C-suite and your executive teams, they experience a different tension with the shareholders. So if you are able to just talk, I'm sure some of your clients may be from the C-suite, and how you see what they manifest with in terms of mental health. We really look forward to listening to you, Dr. Linda. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, everybody. And gosh, what a tough act to follow. I've had 3 really good speakers. So a lot of what's been covered already will probably show up in what I'm going to say. And Judy, I'll do my best to put some of that in at the end. So I'm going to talk macro and micro. So I think you've heard a bit of both already. You've had a really good context already. And you've had a lot of information about all the enormous effects of the situation we find ourselves in. So let me start by giving the context. And when I say the world has gone nuts, what do I mean? So we use this particular acronym, NUTS, to explain when there's a situation like this. So the N stands for novel. And I don't know if it's novel, people pronounce it differently, but even the virus has got it in its name. So when we say novel, we mean that this is completely new. Ebola was terrible, but it was there. The hurricanes were over there. There are many things happening over there. But for the first time ever, whether you're a celeb, whether you're royalty, whether you're just me, it doesn't matter who you are. This virus is all over the place and it's novel. We've never had a threat like that before. Then the U stands for uncertainty. So if you want to make somebody anxious, think about a horror movie. You have this music building and there may be a shadow, and that's where we find ourselves. There's this uncertainty that's going to cause massive spikes in stress and anxiety. And all of our speakers already today have talked about this, that you don't know day to day what's going to happen next in terms of work. Are you going to get sick, etc., etc. The next one is T, and that stands for threat. So we've got novel, uncertainty, and threat. So the threat is big and the threat is real, because this virus cannot be bought, bribed, or bullied. You know, as I said earlier, it happens to everybody and it's invisible. You don't know when it's going to hit you, and we don't really know who's asymptomatic or who's not. So you can see where stigma is starting to come into this. And so we just, wherever we look, wherever we put on any device, there's threat, threat, threat. So in terms of work, it's not at all like it used to be. There's novelty, there's uncertainty, and massive threat. So if you still have a job, are you going to get your salary? If you're in sales, for example, are you going to be able to do anything with that? So there's threat all over the place. And then there's still the threat of the actual virus. And what Garth mentioned earlier, some of the human level threat, you know, in your home, when home is no longer a safe space. So there's threat all over the place. So the last one, the S, actually, if you think about it, this is the only place where today we can actually do something. And this is the sense of control. So I think a lot of people are feeling helpless and hopeless, but hopefully after this morning, there's going to be an increase in the sense of control. So this is why I say the world has gone nuts. And we've heard a lot of information already about the macro, you know, the context, which I think is always incredibly important. This is the context we're in, this pandemic. It's a nuts situation. So let's go micro, because that's where I'm much better, which is at the individual level. And at the end of the day, we're all individuals. So let's make it real. So I'm going to paint 4 quick pictures for you. And these are just 4 that came to mind. So these people all gave permission for their stories, but I'm going to change their names slightly, or some of the details. So let's take Chris. So he's got a factory. It's a little factory. And he started small number of years ago, 2030. And he started with a few staff, and they grew with him, and their family and their friends kind of came along and worked for him as he expanded. He set up a fund for the education of the kids, and you know, so it's like almost a community, really, like an extended family. And now he's been hit. He cannot operate, he can't open, so he can't pay his rent. He's still paying the workers, even though they can't be there. And he's thinking, well, even when I'm allowed to actually open, will the product that I'm making, which is school stuff, pencil bags, school bags, toys, things like that, is anyone going to be interested? Will I get my stuff into the shops? Will there be enough turnover to carry on going? So what does he do? Does he close? Then what about all these staff? Does he not? What does he do? So there are many Chris's, I think, in the country right now. And then we talk about Anna. So she is more in the C-suite, and 50% of her team, this is real, I had this conversation last week, 50% of her team, 50, have been retrenched in a particular corporate. And for weeks and weeks, they didn't know this was going to happen. And she was the one who had to look them in the eye and do this and tell them, I'm sorry. And out of the people who left, they're all looking at her. There's no trust left anymore. And she heard somebody actually say this, I'm just done. I can't do this. It was a man. And I think I'm just going to jump, you know. And there were a few nervous giggles on the Zoom call, but then nothing. So she's thinking, well, you know, I'm not even in the office with him. What's he going to do? Do I need to call him? What do I do? So she herself, while thinking this, is trying to deliver impossible targets, because that's still happening, believe it or not. And her kids are homeschooling. She's a single mom. So there is one computer between 3 kids and her without support. So you can just imagine what's going on in that house, trying to work on her phone, Wi-Fi, etc. So this is her situation. And so she's completely different to Chris, but is she? Then there's Mabasa. I spoke to him a couple of days ago. He's a 30-something lawyer. And he said to me, I feel so guilty because I am drowning in work. I am liquidating. I'm business rescuing. I am drowning in work. I'm just working 12 hours a day. I don't know what to do with myself. And so I was thinking, well, good, you're earning, because I'm perhaps also very busy at the moment. And then he said the thing. He said, but I feel so guilty because my parents have a shop and it's gone. It's over. I've had to actually close their business down. It was devastating. So I have to work like this because I now have to support mom and dad, because there's no way in their 60s that they're going to be able to set up a shop again. And I feel so guilty when I say I'm tired, because I can see it in people's eyes, what at least you're earning. And so I just have to sit with this. Now, this guy is going to burn out if he's lucky and have a heart attack if he's not. So that's him. And then we have Sylvia, and there are many Sylvias. So she's a domestic worker, around 60. She's at home. She can't leave. She's got limited funds. She's hoping she'll still have a job. She is hoping that she's actually going to get a salary, because she doesn't know. Maybe she has a contract, maybe she doesn't. I know some Sylvias who said, well, I don't know about UIF, UQ, and then they give you different numbers, and some months you don't get, and some months you get only half, and you don't know why. And she's sitting at home with a grandchild. The parent is stuck in another province because they have to work, they can still earn a bit. And it's her, the grandchild, who's got cabin fever and difficult, there's not really a garden. And the husband, who is late 60s, sitting there frustrated, can't work either, can't earn, and he's abusive. And he's starting to be verbally abusive, and sooner or later we don't know where this is going to go. So these are 4 scenarios, and maybe you know these people, maybe you are these people, maybe these are people you've heard about, but these are the people all around us. So whether you're the big boss who has to do the dirty, or under pressure because you still have to make this company survive, or you're thinking, what do I do with my people who become like family? Or you're the person who's sitting there thinking, I have no power here, and I just hope that somebody's still going to give me money somehow. Or whether you are the family or the friends or the neighbors, you know, we're all in this thing together. So we are all having to make decisions we never thought we'd have to make in terms of how we work, how we school, how we travel or not at this stage, you know, how we cope with this thing. And then there's another group. So Garth mentioned the unseen, and I think these are often the unseen. So not just mental health, but the mental health professionals. The healthcare workers as a whole are seen, the doctors and the nurses, but you know, the individuals, a lot of them are my clients as well. And then of course, journalists. You know, there's this non-stop trauma that you're exposed to firsthand, and this is leading to secondary trauma, and eventually it hits you and it becomes compassion fatigue. Now, I don't know about you, but you know, if you have to be sick and you've got a doctor who's making medical decisions, who's compassion fatigued, there's an exhaustion, and then there's a cynical attitude that comes, and just a numbness, questioning, am I doing the right thing? So these are factors in compassion fatigue. These are not things that we need in our mental and physical healthcare professionals. And for our journalists, who are right there, face to face, with these harrowing situations, these heart-rending, you know, situations where you're hearing stories, where you're seeing people on the ground who are actually starving, who are desperate, who, as Cassie was saying, are now in food queues, and they had this prospect for a career a few weeks ago. So this is definitely also vicarious trauma, that it sort of pops onto you. And then there's something which we call armchair trauma, which is all of us, you know, everybody, which is any news feed you're watching, or anything you wherever you are, you're hearing corona, you're seeing masks, you're just flooded by this information. And so we're all just paralyzed, and we're having this armchair trauma. So I've stopped looking at social media because I just reverberate from just the horrific stories and images, and you know, there's a powerless feeling. There's not very much you can do about it, although I'm going to say something about that at the end. So there are a lot of common factors here. I'm just going to put them all into 3. So the first of these is grieving. So the world is grieving, and there's a lot of information about that out there. It's also in your packs. So I'm just going to touch on the main things. So the problem is that when this virus hit, we had lockdown, we were all terrified, and there it was. So we had many losses, and we were in shock denial. Then we moved into the stage of bargaining, and then of course blame comes to that, you know, who's responsible, and that's still going. And then we moved into the emotion, which was first of all anger. Why has this happened? And we were angry with business because you've messed up the planet perhaps, or angry with, You know, why did the WHO not tell us information? And we were just angry with anyone we could be angry with. And then we started being sad and feeling helpless and despairing and just hopeless. I can't do anything. And that's when usually people drink or smoke or exercise. I'm not going to go into the problems there right now. And then, of course, terrible fear and anxiety and paranoia. You know, who's got this thing? Will I get it? And what's going to happen to me? Then we realized the economic impact. Then we started all over again. It can't happen to me. It mustn't happen to me. Maybe it did happen to me. And then there was the bargaining. What can I do? What can I do to make it not happen to me? How can I get money? How can I hustle? I'm hearing people say that quite a lot. And then the blame. Then the anger, the sadness, the fear, and then a little bit of acceptance. But I saw when lockdown went from 5 to 4, that there was this sort of feeling, oh, thank goodness, there's just a little bit of relief in some shape or form. But there wasn't so much. And I've seen, again, I don't know how much is real or not, but, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire. That there are very disturbing images of what's happening with the police in terms of commerce and so on. I don't need to go into all of that detail. So again, we start this shock denial. How can this be that this is my country? How can this be? You know, and then we go through all of those stages again. So we're having multiple loss and grief. So that's the first batch of what's going on here. And that's for everybody, whether you're the boss, you've got your job, you've lost your job, the decision maker, the person who is cleaning the rubbish in the shopping center, who's serving you at the till. Everybody's in that situation, okay? The second thing is survival. We are all trying to survive, and I don't just mean the virus. You know, to eat, you need money. To get money, where do you get it? You need a job, or you need to access that money that's been made available that you see on the news. To sell, you need customers. You need to be open. You need people to be able to come to your store. So survival looks different for everybody, but at the end of the day, you have to eat, and you have to pay certain bills and pay certain people. So that's the survival aspect, and a lot has been said about that. And this is why I commend the business organizations for getting together to actually work with this particular aspect. We desperately need this. And then, of course, the third one, and you'd think that would be top, is staying safe. And that's to do with the virus. How do you stay safe? But, you know, we're also getting a bit paranoid. And, you know, who around us is safe? Not just who's a carrier, but this is, again, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but our decision makers and our police and so on, problem, because we're counting on these people to keep us safe or to help us all to stay safe. And I'm not sure that that's always happening. So this is also, it's linked to another point, which is around the staying safe. There's also a mental health component, which is stigma. You know, we're looking around, paranoid, who's asymptomatic, who isn't. And this is also for people physically going back into the workplace, you know, looking around who's safe, who isn't. And because of that, and because of the stigma around, oh, you've got the virus, or you could have had the virus. And it's ridiculous, but we do it, okay? When we get scared, we become like this. And so people are going to hide. Oh, no, I'm sure that's just a normal sore throat. I need this job. You know, I can't afford to lose this. And so you can see where that's going to have a knock-on effect. And I've seen lots of articles here and abroad where it's difficult at the moment to tell who's got real OCD and who's just in hysterics around cleaning and hand washing, who's got real generalized anxiety, and who's actually just struggling with the mental health aspects of the situation, of the pandemic, the economy, the finance, the socio-political, et cetera, and who's got clinical depression, real depression, and who's just feeling this absolute, you know, there's no future, I've got no power, I'm helpless, I'm hopeless. So it's becoming very difficult to tell who's got a clinical disorder and who's actually just going through this traumatic situation. And to this, I'm going to add high levels of anger and frustration, which I've been watching carefully and worries me greatly, which is when anger is impotent, as in when it's suppressed, because we can't blame anybody really. So the anger is sitting there and it's suppressed. And there's a lot of research showing how that leads to cardiac events and other health-oriented things. but it also leads, exactly as Garth was saying at the beginning, much more eloquently than I'm going to say, it also leads to this unrest, to this movement, to spreading. It starts to spill out sideways. First in the homes, in terms of domestic violence. I'm even seeing it in terms of things like skin picking, self-harm, people becoming aggressive with inanimate objects. Sooner or later, that spills beyond. And again, it's like nuclear energy, anger. You can implode, you can explode, or you can hopefully channel it in the right direction. And this is again where I commend organizations who are trying to channel this energy in the right direction. So this is my context, where as individuals, we are all these Annas and Chris's and Mabasas and Sylvias. We're all grieving, trying to survive, trying to stay safe. We've all gone a bit OCD and depressed. So what are we going to do about it? Because now I've depressed all of you. So there's not much control outside of us in terms of the broader situation. But the good news is, even if you're sitting here in your house on lockdown, your mind can still go somewhere else. You could think moon and you could be on the moon. There are all these virtual tours and things I hear about museums and so on. So the mind can go. And this is why we need to work on the mind. That's where the emphasis has to come in for me. So also keeping in mind that the mind can go to good and bad neighborhoods. And we want to try and make sure that it goes to the good neighborhoods. So I've got 4 coping tips for what you can do to approach a situation like this. And the core is that if you've got a balanced mind, you are going to make better decisions wherever you are, be it C-suite, be it you with your employees, be you the employee. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're the parent trying to get your child to do online schooling, it sounds very similar to what Judy was talking about earlier, about the people making the decisions and their relationships here. Because work is work, whether it's in a corporate or in the home. So what are we going to do? So number 1 is to reset. So all of us are feeling this building of emotion that we're not in control of. So I'm going to talk you through this. I've got 2 ways of resetting. So the first one is where you breathe. You do this in conjunction with squeezing. So I've got a pen. So you can squeeze anything, squeeze ball or whatever. So, and this is an instant reset. So squeeze and breathe in. Slowly out through your mouth as you release. So if you're driving, wherever you are, if you've got nothing to hold, you make a fist. So the squeeze and the release. No time to get into all this detail. So what we're going to be, I'll just give you a summary. And when you breathe out through your mouth, very, very slowly, it triggers the parasympathetic response, triggers the vagus nerve, it just drops the anxiety, it drops the pressure. So about 3 to 5 of those breaths, instant reset. And the other one, of course, not if you're driving, but the other one is, and you can all do it with me now, think about something that's stressing you individually right now, and just spend a few moments. And now close your eyes and tell me what you can see. Well, not tell me, but what can you see with your eyes closed? So I'm talking about using your senses. What is your visual sense actually seeing? And the answer should be nothing. Back of your eyelids. If you're telling me about the screen and the room and anything else, that's your imagination or thinking. So you want to get away from that, reset. What can I actually see with my eyes closed? And that would be the back of your eyelids, blacky grey, not very much. So that technique is where we separate from the thinking imagination, which leads to those bad neighborhoods sometimes, to just what can I actually see right now? And this is a very good reset. And I've taught this to many journalists who've been having to go out and engage people, and sometimes with the authorities. I've taught this to people in the mental health and in the medical field. And I think generally you can use this. If you're at work and you're about to give somebody very bad news, if you think you're going to be called in to get bad news, if you wake up in the morning and you think, I can't, before that spiral starts, reset immediately. And this is where this is an instant reset. So you can also do it physically, grounding yourself. I can feel the chair I'm on, the clothes on my body, the ground under my feet. So these are simple, but they just help to break that cortisol rush. So they're not enough for everybody, but these are things generally that you can use to try and reset. So it's the grounding, fact, senses, versus the imagination, catastrophizing, and then the breathing, just breathing out slowly through the mouth. That calms you down physically. So that's number one, the reset. Number two is the reality test. So we don't want to be in our reality right now. I think we'll agree. But we need to actually accept this is where we are and try and work where you have the power. So there are 3 building blocks of all thoughts. And there is a free download on one of my websites, which I'll give you, which has this whole technique. But basically, there's controllable, uncontrollable, and extreme. So the controllable is me right now. The uncontrollable is past, future, and other people. But a lot of our thoughts go there. What's going to happen? What if they? If only. Okay? Uncontrollable. And the 3s are your extremes, which are that sort of magical thinking. If I leave the house, this will happen. If my boss calls me in, I'm definitely going to be fired. That if this happens, I have no recourse. There is absolutely no one I can ask for help. Okay? So these are the number 3 thoughts that need to be reality tested. So the best thing to do is those number 2s is identify that they're uncontrollables and try and get rid of them, because they're sucking time and energy out of you, which is a waste. The third, the 3s, I call them 1s, 2s, and 3s. The 3s need to be reality tested, as in what are the facts and am I making links which aren't necessarily there? What are the actual facts? I have been asked to come to a meeting. That's the fact. I can go into the meeting freaking out or not. So this is then where the power comes back to the number 1, which is me. Even if there's a little bit of control, what can I do? What support do I need? So these might seem very simplistic, but they work incredibly well. I've been teaching them for about 28 years now, and they really do work, as simple as they are. But I like things that are simple you can use immediately. So it's all about the reality test. These are the R's, reset, reality test. Then there are 2 S's. So the next one is self-care. Cassie mentioned that. So I just want to say to you, you can't give what you don't have. And so I say this to my friends and clients who are doctors and nurses. You must sleep after 24 hours because you're going to make a mistake and people could die. You must. Okay, so that's the self-care aspect. You cannot give what you don't have. And we know the airplane example. Put your own mask on first. Otherwise, you and the child will die. So this one I think we know about, and we want to prevent the compassion fatigue. And the last S is the support. So I did my doctorate on cancer, and we looked at prognosis and anxiety diagnosis and a whole lot of things. And one of the things that surprised me was that social support was actually as significant as spirituality and having close family ties and access to medical care. It was equal to those in terms of prognosis and coping with cancer. And that just intrigued me because I thought, what is this thing? And it turns out that it's actually easier to get than you think. So there are 5 kinds, and these are also available in a free download on my Thoughts First website. It's in the pack. So I'm just going to run through them. Emotional, safe place to vent. Practical, hands-on. Esteem, you're still a worthwhile person, even if you've made mistakes, even if you handled something unskillfully. You still mean something to someone. Very important. Information, get multiple sources. We know Dr. Google, I'll leave it at that. Companionship, no one is a stranger anymore. You know, the whole world is in this situation. So it's incredibly important that we identify sources of this support. And this is why we have SADAG. This is why we have these organizations. And this is why I've got a self-help website. I put all this stuff out there for free right now. I'm not the only one. There are free webinars, free courses. There's a lot of stuff that's available. And the companionship, even right now, I don't know all of you, but we're all companions together. So that one is definitely possible. And even if you are alone on lockdown, if you have a pet, if you have a dog, if you have Wi-Fi, sometimes you can just hear people 7 o'clock at night. So there is companionship. So please do use your packs, because there are a lot of free resources on working from home, what to do if you've lost your job, signs of depression, stigma going back to work, how to stay motivated. There are a lot of resources. SADAG has a call center which is available all the time. And so please do use those. So that's that S, the support. So it's the reset, reality test, self-care support. And then I'd just like to conclude with, Cassie said earlier, we're all in the same situation. I think, you know, Judy, Garth, you've said the same thing, and me too. So I'm going to just tweak that slightly. So I'm going to say to you, we're in the same ocean, but are we in the same boat? We know that's not true. So some boats are leaky. Some are just woefully inadequate for the size of the waves. But all of us here today are part of bigger organizations. So we're part of big fleets. And perhaps our boat is a little hardier. And I'm hoping some of these techniques will help keep our boats hardy. And so it's up to us to help those who are drowning, who are falling out of their boats, who are hanging onto a bit of log. And if our boat is strong and we all act collectively with a fleet that is there in terms of mental health, we are definitely going to be able to help the people who are drowning. So thanks for indulging me and giving me so much time, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lucinda, Linda, and there's much that I can reflect on, but I'm only going to use your closing comment, which was the double S, and that is the question. And I think we need to be very vigilant in business. Whilst we are in the same ocean, we are not in the same boat, because that then taps into our own resource base in terms of our lived realities. I'm now going to hand over to Danny, who's going to manage the Q&A. And once again, on behalf of Business for South Africa, thank you so much for joining us. We've hit 58 in terms of our group who have Zoomed in today, and I think that is indicative of a healthy webinar. So over to you, Danny and Sandra. Some questions have been coming through on the chat group. So if I could now hand over to you to moderate the Q&A.
Thanks, Judy. And thank you to all of our panelists. That was, I think, extraordinary. I think all of us were listening with 2 ears. 1 ear, you know, from a media perspective, is there a story? And then all of us listening from our own personal experience. And I'm sure we all related to all the advice and the insights that were provided. I'm just going to raise some of the questions that were put on the chat group. But I would first just like to say to you that Sandra and I will leave our email addresses. Sandra's going to put them back on the chat group just to remind you, and our telephone numbers. If any of you would like to interview any of the panelists afterwards or have any questions, please reach out directly to us via email or phone, and we're happy to help you. And once again, we are going to put the guidelines, which are also on the chat group, and a recording of this Zoom seminar on the Business for South Africa website, which is www.businessforsa.org. They should be up fairly soon after the webinar is finished. So just some questions. Let me get through to them. Hang on a second. So first of all, are medical scheme benefits for mental health meeting the current need? And how many companies offering these kinds of employee support programs are making a meaningful impact? And does gap cover address mental health costs? Is there any one of our panelists who'd like to jump in on those questions?
Well, certainly from the side of a practicing psychologist, and I'm going to ask Prof. Stevens as well from the PsySSA, wearing your PsySSA hat, if you would come in. So PsySSA and SADAG, as far as I know, approached some of the larger medical schemes and had, let's just say, strong conversations. And so, yes, so the telehealth is being covered right now. Thank you to Cassie and Garth for your efforts in that regard.
Prof, is there anything you'd like to add there?
I mean, look, let me just say that The question about what is enough is a kind of question like how long is a piece of string, you know. I think that there are always going to be instances where both our public health system and our private health system actually could do better. I think we have to be clear that in terms of mental health provision, the mental health provisions for both in public and private healthcare at the moment is simply not enough. And in some ways, mental health is often relegated to much lower status than many other conditions. So one of the things that I would always be arguing for is advocating for additional resources to mental health within the public or the private sector.
Okay. Cassie?
Yes, it's such an important question. And I think, you know, before COVID-19, there were a lot of people who pay for a medical aid but have no idea what a PMB is. A lot of what we even do on our phone calls is some of the questions we ask is if you are on a medical aid, and we try to help educate people what their benefits are. Even if you're on the lowest hospital plan to the top plan, everyone is entitled to PMB. So I think a lot more can be done, specifically even during COVID, to create awareness and educate, whether it's from the medical schemes, whether it's from companies, to create awareness around what benefits are available and how to access them, and how PMBs could help. Again, we're trying to prevent crises from happening. If people can benefit or access some of their benefits, they can reduce crises from happening and people having to be hospitalized, but rather managing their mental health would be a lot smarter. As Prof has also mentioned, there aren't enough resources for mental health. I mean, even as SADAG, we don't get funding from the Department of Health. We're having to rely on private donors and doing interesting fundraising events to support these mechanisms that are in place to help so many South Africans who don't have access to resources. We have also made sure with the Department of Health that there are specific guidelines that make sure that clinics and hospitals and psychiatric facilities still run and still function throughout COVID-19, that there's no disruption. So a very good point. There should be a lot more awareness and education, especially for members on medical aids, on how to access these benefits. And we know for medical aids from their different reports is mental health is normally the one or the second most claimed illness under any medical aid. And that's why it should be made a priority that more people are aware about these benefits.
Thank you. So to the next question, a number of our panelists this morning have raised the issue of the conflict between the SANDF and SAPS with citizens, especially in terms of the abuse of power that we've seen, particularly amongst SAPS, and what kind of effect this might have on citizens' trust. Is this not driving more anxiety because these are the people that are meant to be keeping the peace, maintaining the regulations, and providing that sense of security, but they're in fact creating more fear? Anybody like to answer that question?
Well,
I mean,
I'll make some comments.
Give it a go.
Okay, Garth, you first. I'll add.
Belinda, you go first. You go first.
Well, you know, I'm just thinking from that individual perspective, and Garth, I'm sure you can give a context. I do worry about trust. This is something I've been flagging, and I think probably all of us in the mental health area, that, you know, trust is fundamental. It's the first thing that a baby learns when they arrive. And what worries me is I think, Garth, you mentioned the word covenant earlier, that what's happening with this covenant between us and the decision makers and the people we're trusting to enforce that. So that does worry me. And I saw one of the questions around cigarettes, and I'll just take that as one example. That's as well something, it was the about face that I think was the problem. So the trust is a very big issue at the moment. And of course, it's going to make people anxious, but it's going to make them angry. And this is what worries me perhaps more than the anxiety. And over to you, Garth.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I think that one of the things about all societies in which there's a breach in the trust in governance systems, whether those are the police systems, the security apparatus, the government itself, when one starts to see a breach in trust systems like that, actually what you start to get is an imposition of kind of community level order. And I think one of the problems there is that you start to see greater social fragmentation, you start to see the breakdown of social capitals. You start to see communities essentially taking the law into their own hands in some way. So if you take the example of, I don't know, something like xenophobia. Part of the reason why xenophobia is able to occur at a given point in time is because there's a breach in the kind of social contract between those systems of governance and communities. There's a kind of loss of trust in those systems. And actually people take those systems into their own hands and regulate mobility. They regulate who's able to come in. They regulate who can do. They regulate who can sell, etc., etc. So my concern with the breach in trust, with the SAPS and the SANDF, for example, is that actually what you can ultimately generate is a greater sense of disorder under those circumstances.
Okay. Kathy?
I think I'd also like to add, you know, again, from what people are phoning SADAG and sharing, and from what people are also saying, is that we forget that in communities and in townships where there's a very strong police force, and it's army vehicles and it's armed people, it's very scary, and it adds to the anxiety and it fuels that stress. And I think this could also be triggering trauma, even PTSD. We've had calls from people who've even said that it's reminded them how it used to be during apartheid, where, you know, it's that fear in that sense. And we mustn't underestimate that has a profound impact, not only as adults and people having to deal with this first time dealing with lockdown, but the impact that it has on children, and having important conversations around that, because this will be, again, something that we're dealing with for a very long time.
Thanks. Cassie, can I just stay with you for a second? There's some questions.
Sorry, could I just, because remember this is Business for South Africa. So I think the trust question cuts across all service providers. And maybe the psychologist and Cassie, you can talk to that you sign a contract with your employer, and that in part of that contract, implicit or not, is a trust equation. And what COVID is doing now, it's eroding trust on the workplace. So you can imagine how unsafe that must be. So again, the next round of questions, if you could just talk to the trust deficit between the employer and the employee, and then of course, for those of us who are running companies, how you manage trust with government. Thank you.
Would our panelists like to address the issues that Judy just raised?
I think, you know, Judy, what you were saying, it needs a big unpack, but if we're looking at the trust within, I have a contract with you, so, you know, I employ you, and a contract's all about rights and responsibilities. That's probably, you know, the core of what a contract is. And I don't know that everybody has a bad intention. I mean, I'm sure there are people here and there kind of abusing the situation and just firing and letting people go and so on. I get that. But that happened before anyway. So I think what's different here is that it's not just that it's my contract with you, person. It's that there's COVID, and then there's the economy, and then there's the legislation, shall we say, that's come with it. So those three things are like three interferences in our relationship. And this is why I think it's so important that we actually work collectively like we're doing, you know, with one voice, that fleet, because otherwise it's never going to work. So to expect the individual, be it a one-man show or be it a bigger corporate, to expect that decision maker to take all the responsibility in terms of having broken the trust and breached that covenant, I don't think that's fair. So that's just my point on this.
Prof?
So yeah, I mean, let me just say that on the matter of how one starts to kind of re-establish trust with government, for example, from a business perspective. I mean, I was talking earlier about you know, what Galinda's speaking about is a kind of covenant or contract or compact that is a social compact of sorts. And I think that this is a moment to do this. Now, in this time, I think what this entails is a degree of dialogue. It entails a degree of consultation that is consistent. I think that in the main, government is trying to do that. If one thinks about government's relationship to kind of, you know, the health sciences at the moment, I think they've been trying to do that in relation to the economy and so on. But you can see that there are moments when that dialogue between government and the citizenry breaks down. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is to, in a time of crisis, we should not be kind of retreating into the lowest common denominator. What we should be doing is, in fact, asking for more under these circumstances. When I talk about that, I'm really asking us to ask for more from government. Actually, this is a time to keep accountable, not to hand over the kinds of responsibilities simply to the state. Actually, this is a time to build civil society. This is a time to ensure that civil society has a voice. This is a time to ensure that business has a voice. This is a time to ensure that labor has a voice. One has to compel dialogue under these circumstances. Otherwise, I think the potential for a breach in trust will continue as we hand over more and more responsibility to those who think that that we think will carry the obligation to take care of the rest of South Africa.
Thank you. Some practical questions coming through for managers or senior executives who have employees who may be well feeling stressed or anxious and find themselves wanting to end it all, as Dr. Linda mentioned in her example. What advice do you have for employers and managers dealing with this situation? And then to follow up, obviously in many businesses, there are employees who feel that they can't speak to managers or HR or anyone about the stress and fear and anxiety that they're feeling because they're tech. Dr. Linda, do you want to put that?
I was actually looking at Cassie because I think that SADAG plays an enormous role. You know, I know that from debriefing counselors and things. So that's one avenue. In the packs, I know that there's a list of many others. So, you know, you cannot do it alone. And I'm going to use that fleet example all the time. That, you know, if you're the individual person and you've got your people, you know, you're not a mental health professional for a start, and you've got many, and you're trying to run something, and now what do? So I would always get support, always. I always say that, and get the right support. So the second question, which was around HR or EAP, if you, for whatever reason, feel that you can't access it in there, if you have a medical aid, good, because then there's a possibility you could access it privately. And then, of course, this is where SADAG comes in, and maybe Cassie can add to that. But in that moment, in that exact moment that somebody feels they're going to end it all, very simplistically, please quote me carefully on this if you need to. So suicide is associated with an escape or a message. So some people will be, I'm going to kill myself so that you can see what you've done to me. And that's often more with the teenager. Whereas the escape, you know, I think we're all feeling it from time to time. I can't do this. So that's what suicide is about. So keep it talking. You've got to keep the communication going. And we have suicide helplines at SADAG. And these are people who are specifically trained. There's a protocol that we go through. And there's somebody on the other end of the line. So even if you phone that line yourself with your person and you connect them with somebody on the other end. And sometimes just empathizing that, you know, obviously it depends on the relationship, but just empathizing as in, I don't know what to say. I'm feeling as stuck as you are. And if it's appropriate, you could touch on an arm, or if it's someone closer to you, maybe a hug. You know, those things are little things, but they all basically are signaling you matter to me. You know, you still have value to someone. So these are just some practical things. And of course, this is not, I'm not trying to be casual about suicide at all, but these are just some ideas of something that you could do immediately. And I'm sure Cassie can add.
Again, I think this could be a whole webinar because there's so many practical tips and tools. And I think, you know, one of the things that we do with having a suicide crisis line is that someone is reaching out for help. They're calling in because they're in a desperate situation, and they often feel incredibly helpless and hopeless. And I think a lot of employees and employers can also relate to that. Our counselors are obviously there to provide crisis intervention. So we don't have a magic wand or a magic tool, but it's about asking key questions. And perhaps from this, we can actually look at hosting webinars on mental health first aid, and especially for managers or leaders on how do you have that conversation? You know, no one ever teaches you how to talk about suicide or what to do if someone says it's they're not coping. From a survey that we did a number of years ago looking at stigma of mental health in the workplace, one of the things that people spoke about is that while if they disclosed or opened up to a manager or a line manager about their mental health, the manager normally just didn't say anything because they didn't know what to say. And I think that also just highlights that we don't always know what to say around mental health, but there are tips and tools. And I think we can definitely share resources and make sure that we post it, and perhaps that can be a conversation in a bigger webinar. So I think it's practical tools that anyone could do to at least facilitate getting someone into care.
Thank you. I'm going to close the Q&A now and then hand over to Judy just to thank everybody. But just before I do that, I'd like to repeat that the guidelines are posted on the chat. Maybe you want to download them before the Zoom call ends. They will also be on the Business for South Africa website shortly. And you're welcome to send any more questions or requests for interviews through to either myself or Sandra. Our emails are in the chat group. And I hope that we are going to be able to do more of these, because I think today has been an extraordinary step forward in opening up a conversation around mental health. So just from Business for South Africa, from our side, I'd like to thank Cassie Chambers from SADAG and Dr. Linda and Professor Stevens. And then I'd like to hand over to Judy to conclude.
So thank you very much, everyone. And on behalf of Business for South Africa, a very, very big thank you to you. And as a woman in business, as a single mom in business, as a woman in an industry that evaporated overnight, and I mean evaporated overnight, the tourism sector, everything our psychologists talked about, I've been on that roller coaster. However, as my closing comments from a business point of view, firstly, everyone in a leadership position in business, and that can be on the factory floor, on the farm, make sure that there is an open approach, that you say to your staff, your colleagues, your peers, my door is open. Secondly, demonstrate supportive listening, very important. Be consistent. For those of us in business, be consistent. Make sure that you do not raise expectations that in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, you can no longer deliver on. Be frank, brutally honest, because this is what ensures that your workers and your employees will still deliver and be productive, even though it's very difficult. Very importantly, make sure that you have your finger on the pulse in terms of your teams. So we call it keep a constant pulse, check in.
Just a matter of trying to get protocols in place.
And then finally, communicate. Oh, oops, okay, I'm coming to an end. Communicate the available resources that you as an employer will make, whether it's 5 in the company, 500, 500,000. And then finally, thank you all for joining us. And I do hope that we will emerge, not I hope, I want to make sure that we emerge as better leaders, better people, better companies, as we promote a culture of mutual self-reliance. Thank you so much all, and we'll keep you posted. Be safe, stay strong, and stay sane. Thank you from B4SA.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.